Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great honor for a historian, obviously, to speak at an Academy of Arts. Now, as was already kind of announced, my special field is rather social history from below and history of economic reforms. And I'm going to talk more about that because I think it is important for all of us to understand why we are in this mess, why nationalism is so much on the rise, because this is one of the main reasons. And well, I decided to prepare the talk in English because I'm aware that, well, that is our lingua franca, and I'm aware that via Zoom there's a large, rather English than German-speaking audience. But because of that, I wrote it down in a manuscript, and it's not a free speech. I hope that will be okay. I mean, after lunch, you know, it's always a problem to listen to that kind of speeches. Well, after the end of history, the rise of right-wing nationalism and, so to say, the deeper causes. 1 week ago, we could celebrate once more the unification of Germany, which in many ways was a reunification of Europe. It marked the end of the revolutions in 1989, also in a much less utopian way than the people out on the streets had demanded in Berlin, Prague, Sofia, and parts of the Soviet Union. Our keywords in Prague, where I happened to be 30 years ago, were freedom, democracy, humanity, and solidarity. And I think we always should remember these values. Also, we eventually got only a reduced economic version of freedom. Most European countries introduced variants of democracy as well. Now, this combination of free capitalism and some sort of democracy was pretty much in line with the prediction of Francis Fukuyama and his famous end of history. This neoliberal order looked quite stable until the big crash of 2008 and 2009, when the American real estate bubble burst and the world was on the brink of a financial meltdown. Now, since then, other ends of history loom large on the horizon. Liberal democracy is on the retreat even within the European Union. And so what I want to do with you today is to discuss the deeper causes of anti-liberalism and the recent rise of right-wing nationalism. I will conclude with a normative and political argument. What we need today is a revival of internationalism, however, not the pervasive neoliberal version, but a social and liberal version. And I think that the initiative of the Academy of Arts goes in that direction, and I hope that I can contribute at least some ideas to it. After Brexit and the election of Donald Trump in the annus horribilis of 2016, we must ask ourselves what has gone wrong in the last 3 decades after the so-called annus mirabilis. Why has history reached an end, or rather multiple ends, so different to the one predicted in '89? It can be stated, by the way, for the defense of Fukuyama, that he was not alone with his poorly reasoned theory. Politicians on all sides and many academics shared his triumphalism about the perceived Western victory in the Cold War. Now, 30 years later, we know once more that capitalism can work without democracy or behind a democratic facade. This is evident in China, where the communists liberalized the economy but not the political system. The impetus for this was also set in '89 with the massacre on the Tiananmen Square. 10 years later, to remain in the rhythm of jubilees, Russia set out on the path of authoritarian state capitalism, and another 10 years later, Viktor Orban achieved a 2/3 majority of parliamentary seats for the first time in the climate of the great financial crisis. Ever since, the independence of the legislature and the judiciary has been massively restricted. The media have brought into line, and it has been mentioned a couple of times here already, the Central European University has been chased out of the country. But this does not seem to bother German industrial companies, and I'm repeating and writing it again and again. In 2018, BMW was the third large German automobile corporation to choose to build a factory in Hungary, since production costs are so much lower, and according to a law passed 2 years ago, workers can be forced to put in 400 hours of overtime a year to receive then that payment with a maximum grace period of 2 years. Now, the decision to invest in Hungary shows that semi-authoritarian regimes seem to be more attractive for German capital than welfarist democracies. These and many other global investments, especially in China, indicate that Western corporations prioritize maximum profit over democracy. I will return to that in greater detail in the second half of this speech, or second part, on the global hegemony of neoliberalism. In the third part, I will discuss the connections between neoliberalism and anti-liberalism, and following the historical sociologist Karl Polanyi, I understand anti-liberalism as a backlash to too free a market, as a double movement, that's one of his terms, towards more social protection, another Polanyian term. It is no coincidence that Poland, Great Britain, and the US, for so long pioneers of neoliberal economic policy, have swung so far to the right. Now, the right-wing populists and nationalists, it always goes together, initially achieved their majorities primarily in neglected and impoverished regions of their countries. From the perspective of comparative social history, there are many similarities between deindustrialized regions of the neoliberal West and the post-communist East. So this is not a post-East European post-transformation problem. The neoliberal order has produced too many losers here and there, which eventually rebelled and became a great target for right-wing nationalists. So to say, Chapter 1, 89 in a global historical perspective. By pointing to the US, Great Britain, Poland, China, I already pointed out that we need a global framework to analyze the transformation after 89. I would like to add yet another country in Latin America, Chile. In late 88, the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet lost a plebiscitary vote about his future presidency. And this decision was unexpected, since Chile was in the midst of a powerful economic boom that was sustained until the late 1990s. Now, the adherents of the Chicago School of Economics, Reagan and Thatcher, attributed this boom to the radical liberalization and privatization under Pinochet. I then checked at the archives, historians go to archives, of the World Bank, what is about the simplistic causal explanation. And actually, if you then dug deeper into the documents of the World Bank, you can see that one could as well attribute this economic boom to the Christian democratic economic policy that set in with the regime change in '89 and strove for a social equilibrium. At the time, this formula was almost a provocation. But as the unrest last year in Chile shows, probably this was what has been missing since then. However, for the West, for the international financial institutions and economic faculties the world over, the feedback taken was quite different. Chile's success stories seemed to confirm the teachings of the Chicago School of Economics and Milton Friedman. The fact that 40% of the Chilean population had fallen below the official poverty line was mostly ignored. And Chile paid back its debts to American banks, who had been under stress because of the first neoliberal real estate bubble under Ronald Reagan. Now then, the example of Chile, growth, paying back debts, inspired the so-called Washington Consensus, which was again drafted in '89 by the IMF, the World Bank, representatives of the US Ministry of Finance, and high-ranking US congressmen. Initially, the consensus was intended for debt and inflation-ridden countries of Latin America. It was based, so to say, on a 10-point list of measures: economic stability, which generally meant strict austerity policies. Further elements then were a triad of liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. Other features were foreign direct investments and thus global financial capitalism. After the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, this consensus became a blueprint for the reforms in post-communist Europe. Milton Friedman once said, Eastern Europe, hey, it's a testing ground for an experiment, and Poland, but also East Germany, came then first for, getting, so to say, shock therapies. Also, they were not officially always termed as that. Now, then in summing all that up, the year '89 stands not only for the fall of the wall, much celebrated here, of course, and the liberation of East Central Europe from Soviet domination, but for a global paradigm shift in economic policy. Both Chile and then in the '90s Poland were perceived as proof that shock therapies and neoliberal policies work. Yet without the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in Yugoslavia, neoliberal hegemony would not have been so strong. After '89, there was no competing system to serve as a corrective. And additionally, the Western welfare states were themselves in need of reform and too expensive for post-communist countries. Hence, Margaret Thatcher's maxim, "there is no alternative," abbreviated TINA, gained traction. And this basically did not change until the great crisis of 2009. So this hegemony lasted for around 2 decades. Chapter 2, Neoliberalism. What is it? I've used it so often that a definition is overdue. I define neoliberalism as an ideology of economic policy based on the ideal of self-balancing markets and rational market actors. It fundamentally rejects state interference in the economy, strives for privatization, economic liberalization, and deregulation on the national and international level. I should add that I think it's not so productive to construct all that neoliberalism as a boogeyman. I rather use it as an analytical term that is possible. Now, after the collapse of communism, the emphasis was on implementing this Washington Consensus and, above all, the privatization of state-owned enterprises. But then in the late 90s, there was yet another radicalization of neoliberalism, this time not so much in theory, but in the political practice. Around the turn of the millennium, core state competences were privatized. And the liberalization of trade was followed by a liberalization of labor markets, deregulation of the national and international finance markets as well. We got what Karl Polanyi, in his major work, The Great Transformation, termed laissez-faire capitalism. Now, the post-communist countries were global pioneers in the privatization of pension and health systems and the introduction of so-called flat tax systems. This eventually put additional pressure on the moderate left there, but then also in the West. And so the Democrats in the United States and New Labour in Britain supported neoliberal reforms as well. Eventually, as is known here, the Social Democrats pursued a similar policy as well. Now, the Social Democratic Green Coalition implemented sweeping social and labor market reforms. As it happened in other post-communist countries, the old age pension system was partly privatized and the labor market liberalized. Same story again. Now, while the aim in 1990 at German unification had been to swiftly adjust East Germany to the West, Westernization, the red-green reforms introduced adaptation to post-communist Europe. In German, I call this Verostung, Easternization. Now, this is why I've invented, because this happened then in West Germany, in Western Europe, the term co-transformation. Didn't only happen there, but also here. The low-wage sector, introduced as part of the Hartz reforms, could compete with the cost of labor in Poland and the Czech Republic. And the idea of the Ich AG mini-entrepreneurs was supposed to motivate the Germans to become independent, like 4 million Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, and Hungarians who had founded small enterprises in the early 90s. This is part of my social history research. Now, the basic problem of this neoliberal order is that it rewards those individuals, social groups, and regions within the country that are already relatively well off. This can especially be observed in post-communist Europe. The respective capital cities and a few growth regions experienced the boom with almost Chinese growth rates. The standard of living enjoyed by the urban middle classes also reached Western levels. So this is, of course, compared against the initial situation in '89, this was a success. But this transnational convergence went hand in hand with great divergence within the respective countries. Eastern Poland, Eastern Slovakia, Northeastern Hungary, they achieved not even the fifth of the GDP of their own capitals. Sorry for all these statistics, but sometimes they're important. And they were also left behind in terms of purchasing power and wage levels. Now, this, of course, also created envy. If some are doing good and ones who are doing okay or badly, of course, they become envious. Now, this gap between poor and rich regions has narrowed in Eastern Europe since the EU enlargement, but it remains very deep. And it is the region known as Polska B, eastern part of the country basically, that is the bastion of the PiS, the party governing since 2015 and already before since 2005. Now, as in East Germany in the 90s, labor migration was a way to escape poverty, but this migration led to a situation in which many children grew up as one parent or at their grandparents, and hence the transformation was still perceived as suffering and not as awakening. And there's again this gap between the official narrative and what you can find in memories and other ego documents by, so to say, the people. Now, of course, not only the so-called losers of transformation have voted for the peace. The AfD, Germany and Austria, the FPÖ, and similar parties elsewhere also attract voters from the middle classes who fear to lose their status. Now comes part 3, the Great Crisis. I assume that everybody is fairly aware of the course of the global financial crisis in 2008-9. Parallel to the real estate bubble in the US, there was a bubble in Eastern Europe that was also based on speculation in the financial and real estate sector and excessive consumer debt. The Eastern European bubble shows the downside of foreign direct investments, which exploded as a result of the deregulation of the international financial markets. I could show you all this in a PowerPoint, but it would be distracting. Foreign currency credits to private consumers proved especially toxic, bringing Hungary, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine to the brink of economic collapse and state bankruptcy. Now, this crisis had a really devastating economic and political impact. It stopped the previous convergence with the West, and it created a deep crisis of confidence. From the early 90s onward, the post-communist countries had done everything to meet the demands of the EU, and now the West itself revealed massive systemic problems and corruption at the highest level. Economic nationalism was a logical reaction to the currency and financial crisis. In Hungary, Western big banks had lured over 1 million people out of 9.5 million inhabitants into taking out highly speculative foreign currency credits. By the way, this was invented in Austria as mass consumer credits before. Depreciation of the national currency, the Hungarian forint, due to the financial crisis now suddenly saw these debts increase by 50%. So basically, you sit in a house and it's worth less than the credit you have taken. Then came Viktor Orban, exploited this to present himself as the savior of the Hungarian middle class, forcing the Western banks to reevaluate the debts. Now, there is a matter of success there. Just by way of comparison, under Barack Obama, 4.3 million Americans lost their homes and apartments to foreclosure. Now, due to the great rise in unemployment and austerity measures following the crisis in Eastern Europe, around 10% of the working population emigrated from there, and from especially these countries I mentioned before, which were hit worst by the financial crisis. Very many Eastern Europeans left for the then liberal-minded Britain. But due to the economic crisis, the Eastern Europeans were increasingly seen as competition on the labor market. And this was then exploited by the proponents of Brexit. Migration, I think, has generally become such a sensitive political issue because migrants embody the risk of globalization and the regional variant free market European integration. They also offer a more tangible target for demarcation than the international corporations, and investors always stay more anonymous. Now then, in 2011, the southern European countries were dragged down by the euro and sovereign debt crisis. Italy suffered a slump in industrial production and other indicators similar deep to that in Czechoslovakia or Hungary after '89. So la crisi has become a trauma for many families, and especially the young generation. By the way, not all of that can be blamed on neoliberalism. There are also other factors at play. Now, the technocratic governments which came to power in southern Europe in 2011 essentially followed still the list of measures set out by the Washington Consensus. But the austerity programs, they triggered a downward spiral, while the labor market and social reforms did not go very far. In contrast to Eastern Europe in the 90s, there were very little foreign direct investment, and the fundamental political problem is that such neoliberal reforms do not lead nowhere to quick economic recovery, at least not before the next elections. So also in Italy, the liberals and the reformist social democrats paid a hefty political price at the ballot box. In Italy, the left-wing populist Movimento 5 Stelle and the right-wing Lega received more than 30% of the votes. Then in 2016, the Partito Democratico lost the plebiscite about a constitutional reform, and in 2018, they were voted out of government. Now, by coincidence, they're back in because the leader of the Lega, Salvini, overplayed his cards. Nevertheless, if the economy does not recover from the COVID crisis, the far right might be voted to power in a few years. So the danger is not gone. Why I'm pointing at Italy? Because the recent history of Italy, and before, by the way, also Poland, provides another lesson. If right and left-wing populists compete, the right is always winning. The reason is probably quite simple. Nationalism is a more effective rallying cry than the left criticism of global capitalism. Now, chapter 4, from neoliberalism to anti-liberalism, so deeper in the mess yet. When the existing order proves too unsettling or no longer seems sustainable, this provokes counter-movements. In his book, The Great Transformation, Karl Polanyi developed theories and concepts that allow us to grasp the end of transformation as it was understood after '89. For Polanyi, who wrote all this 76 years ago, the globalized free market is in conflict with people's need for social protection. Hence, there always arose double movements, counter-movements opposing globalized capitalism. Our problem today is not the counter-movements themselves, but who is driving them and which ideologies they are associated with. And this brings me to anti-liberalism. Also, I'm a little careful with the suffix "ism" since we are not talking about a fixed ideology. Eastern Europe had been a pioneer of neoliberal reforms, and also Eastern Germany, by the way, but also of the subsequent anti-liberal rebellion against them. In the 90s, the reforms were pushed through with variants of such a slogan, "There is no alternative." And this worked well for quite a while, but at a price for democracy. The electorate was demobilized, more and more people abstained from the elections. Now, in Poland, the pioneer of the pro-market reforms, voter participation dropped below 50% after '95, and much in the United States. So the crisis of liberal democracy, which became such a almost fashionable topic in academia in 2016, well, that was not new at all. Research on populism cannot find consensus concerning the extent to which the very different movements and parties are conglomerates acting opportunistically, this is in the very term populism, right? Or ideologically, or the extent to which left-wing and right-wing populists should be examined together. If we foreground the construction of a true people and the ethno-national redefinition of the nation and visit the electorate, then we cannot include the left-wing populists. Now, all populist parties began usually as protest movements, and indeed, most of the voters initially were the losers of post-communist transformation and, in the West, the losers of globalization. But they also receive support from much broader swaths of the middle classes, as I mentioned before. Now, there's currently a lively debate among political scientists regarding the extent to which right-wing populism rather should be seen as a conglomerate, exploiting various ideologies and using new forms of political mobilization, or whether the ideological orientation should receive greater emphasis. For a historian who has worked in comparative nationalism research, that's what I did in the 0 years a lot, there's quite a coherent ideology that one might characterize as a bundle of promises of protection and security. The right-wing populists promise protection from international competition in the economy, hence the turn against free trade, especially in the UK and the US. They promise protection of the domestic labor market from foreign competition, hence the agitation against illegal immigrants. They promise protection from criminality, also it has been decreasing for years, and protection from terrorism. Of course, now always used with the modifier Islamic. And they promise preservation of national values and the traditional family with clearly defined gender roles. And I think this entire worldview is stringently illiberal. Now, this illiberalism holds such a strong sway because it presents itself as an alternative to the existing system. In Germany, this is of course expressed in the very name of the party, Alternative for Germany, representing an antithesis to this, there is no alternative. Now, of course, since a number of years now, right-wing populism has become a part of the system itself, at least in those countries in which right-wing populists are in government. In the US, if we remember, the moderate conservatives thought Donald Trump would show restraint once he held the high office of president. So it's also the problem of the conservatives, of course, the mainstream conservatives. Now, the opposite, as we all know, has been the case, partly due to the right-wing nationalist ideologues around him who gained attention not just in the media, but above all in their own peer group for their radical positions. And this is something known from nationalism since the 19th century. The louder you cry, the more radical, the more attention you get. And I think the constant repetition of nationalist propaganda has an impact not only on the target audience, on the societies, but on the ones who are saying it. I think we can assume that Orban, for instance, has come to believe his own pronouncement on Muslims as Soros. Now, can this dangerous self-radicalizing illiberalism be traced back to neoliberalism all around? I think this would be to overestimate the history of ideas and the influence of reform politicians, and it would underestimate social and cultural momentum and dynamics. So as a historian, from time to time one has to stress contingencies, and besides that, an apparently similar result, the rise of right-wing populists and nationalists, can have very different causes in different countries and regions. And again, it always depends on the position of the mainstream conservatives. Now, with reference to Polanyi, the interesting question is why the pendulum did not swing to the democratic left after the crisis of 2009, but towards right-wing nationalism. I think it's little use here to point with the finger again at those bad right-wing populists. The moderate left was no longer able to function as a corrective since it had become too close with corporations and the stock exchange after '89. To conclude, concerning the continuities between neoliberalism and illiberalism, there are, of course, some. Both neoliberals and illiberals fundamentally reject public debates and deliberation, which is a hallmark of traditional liberalism. And they repeat the claim that there is no alternative in their own way. These dissenting opinions are dismissed as fake news. What illiberalism and neoliberalism also have in common is contempt for certain sections of the population. Foreigners, minorities, and the losers of transformation, so-called white trash, the homeless. I think the social reforms and cuts since the 90s were in essence a strategy of mobilization through fear. The unemployed and the poor, who did not accept low-paid jobs and other conditions of the neoliberal state, were threatened with even more poverty or social declassification. In short words, the neoliberals permitted and promoted punching down, and they brought up fears. And the right-wing nationalists, they exploit those fears and punch down and sidewards in the ethno-national sense. The final chapter, so to say, now a more optimistic and positive one. An internationalist response. Neoliberalism was very internationalist, one should never forget that. They always point to models in other countries to implement reforms in their own given countries. And so how, could we define a different kind of internationalism, which after all has existed in the past? And how can the EU, how can liberal democracies get out of this political dead end? Of course, that might be even more difficult now as a result of the COVID-19 pandemics, which will for sure aggravate social tensions. The pandemic has also strengthened nationalism on various levels. Borders have been closed, which has been surprisingly popular if you look at public opinion surveys. And the virus has been presented as a foreign danger more or less everywhere. But I think the current crisis also offers a chance, as every crisis. And this can be seen on a political level very recently. At the very moment when the European Union looked really weak and almost appeared to fall apart to its single components, the nation states, it suddenly moved together. In order to fight the economic crisis resulting from COVID-19, the EU member states have opted for more integration, at least for now. So the EU is issuing joint debts and is allowed to raise taxes for the first time. This would have been unimaginable during the global financial and then the euro crisis 10 years ago. And it also shows that maybe some learning from history unconsciously is possible. But I also see dangers ahead. The 750 billion crisis package was designed as an immediate relief program for a brief pandemic. It might be insufficient if COVID-19 drags on or gets worse. And the member states of the EU are starting on top of all that from a very different basis. Of course, it will be much more difficult to revive the Spanish economy or the Italian, La Crisi never was resolved, than the German or the Austrian economy. So this is a big problem. And every single crisis in the past 30 years, I can count, of course, many of them, but I don't do that for time constraints, has led to a rising divergence between rich and poor on an international and a national level. So between countries, but also within countries, between regions, local, urban, rural, and so on. And at least at the moment, some of this scenario is repeating itself. Worst hit, for example, is the service sector proletariat at the moment. However, the main problem in Europe is the still existing welfare system is not that the poor are becoming much poorer, but there are so many new poor. Among them, of course, many artists, actors, musicians, and photographers. This inspired me very early when Der Spiegel asked me for an essay about, the historical look upon pandemics in March. I already wrote then that there should be probably a solidarity fund where regularly employed people, including myself, who is working at the university and received a regular salary every month, might contribute something for funds, for independent artists and so on. So this is all looming large, I think, in the future. Who is going to pay the bill for all the problems we're having? Now, another problem are maybe, coming back to the EU, the too high expectations. Now, the EU Commission has issued this relief program, but what can it actually do? It is only a 30-something thousand people administration, bureaucracy. This is the third of the size of the public service in Berlin. And hence, the European Commission cannot rebuild Europe. This task is left to the single member states. Now, what can the single member states do? Public administrations have been hollowed out by neoliberal policies. And so probably the state does not have the capacity to enact a New Deal, let alone a Green New Deal. There are no government agencies or, a state sector, whatever that means, but it existed in the past, in the post-war period. There are no government agencies who could build large infrastructures like, I don't know, in solar energy or electrified gas stations and so on. Now, of course, private companies can do that, but when will they do it and how and with what kind of profit expectations? And this makes me somewhat skeptical, right? So who can do it? And I think beneath the level of the European Commission and this European level, I think much more mutual assistance is needed between European governments and societies on a multilateral or bilateral level. So why couldn't Italian or Austrian companies help Germany a little bit to close some of the gaping holes in the internet and mobile phone infrastructure? You probably know how to do that, whereas German companies are pretty strong in building up, solar infrastructure, so they might help Italy on that level, and why not do that directly? Now, this is out of our reach, of course, as academics and also as artists, but this is why I think the initiative of the Academy of Arts is important and it's much needed. Of course, it can only be relevant in a small and somewhat symbolic sector, but I think that active solidarity, mutual assistance is needed on all institutional levels, from the national down to the local level. Independent artists, actors, and musicians are greatly endangered by poverty all over Europe, and so international programs, assistance beyond borders would help to fight that poverty, to raise public visibility, to bring it up on the table, and to simply maybe also have more art in public life everywhere to outreach. I think this would also be very important to counterbalance the old and new nationalism. Basil Kersky yesterday evening said about his Center of European Solidarity, we do not want to be alone. And I think he said this also about himself. And I think this is all the more important in the times of COVID-19. And there might be other possibilities to start this. For example, if you think about the situation in Belarus, after all, a European country like Ukraine and a very pro-European country, well, there is an initiative by the German Association of Eastern European Studies to provide stipends, for really actively threatened people, but also to help them to stay there. So maybe that would be a possibility also for academia and the arts, to start a multilateral action for that. And then last but not least, if you think about the long history of the left, from which tradition also Polanyi wrote all his books, much of that was built up through decades of what was called organic work. In Polish, the term is much more known, praca organiczna. So how did it start? With associations, unions, so to say, from below. Now, there's the question, how much we could contribute to that, but there's an obvious target, the service sector proletariat and the transnational one, and maybe it also could be targeted by this alliance of academics. But anyway, I hope very much that I could offer some thoughts, some useful thoughts for this program, and that the program itself will help artists and to reach people all over Europe. Thank you for your attention.